Everyone, welcome. I'm very happy to have you in at the Sopra Steri headquarters in Nieuwegein. My name is Alsmeer van Braan. I'm one of the Mendix practice leads and responsible for the daily operations of our Mendix capability within our Benelux organization. And I'm very happy to have a very interesting talk today. We're going to talk about a dynamic forms application specifically built with Mendix Native Offline capabilities for the Dutch water quality measurements. And I'm very pleased to have our customer RIVM here, Alice and Jasper. They will tell us talk about how they are using Mendix on a day-to-day basis. And we have Wouter Pendres, one of our Mendix MVPs, senior principal expert, who was part of the delivery of the team. And we have Mr. Dr. Jonathan Deal. I wasn't allowed to say the product manager mobile and runtime at Mendix. Product manager at Mendix. He will talk about that's a clicker. It is actually working. He will talk about Bitrise and explain a bit more about how we're going to use it with all the changes that we have from us. And I would like to give the floor to you. Enjoy. If you have any questions, feel free. You've got a mic.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Hi, my name's Jasper. I'm one of the internal Mendix developers at RIVM. I've been a Mendix developer for 5 years now, roughly, but only 3 months at RIVM, so still fresh. I will talk today a bit about RIVM in a general sense, and then Alice will talk a bit more about what we do with Mendix at the RIVM. We're a small internal Mendix team. We're with 4 currently. So Alice is one of my colleagues, but also Giel, who's been working there for 25 years now. So he's a real senior. And also Floor is part of our team, but she's still at maternity leave. So but we still want to mention her today. I want to talk a bit about what RIVM is in a general sense, and what better than start with a movie video. I hope it's gonna work. What is the RIVM? In English, we say the National Institute for Public Health and the Environment. And our goal is to promote public health and a safe living environment through research and knowledge sharing. We're a government institute, so we're owned by the government, sort of, but more specifically the Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sport. However, we're independent, so it's very important to be operating independently from the ministry to be credible for also the general public, and otherwise there could be some concerns about it. We have 3 main clients. First of all, it's the ministry itself, which is our most important client. Other than that, there are also the other ministries, and also municipalities and global organizations like the European Union and the World Health Organization. The RIVM has 5 core tasks, which are the most important thing of what we do or why. First of all is research and knowledge gathering, but also sharing. So, for example, last week there was something about blueberries in the news, which is something the RIVM shares, and this is an important task for the general public. We also advise clients, so that's the ministry mainly, which I talked about previously. We also do prevention programs, so think about vaccination programs and all that type of stuff. Monitoring is another source. So, for example, nitrogen monitoring, which is a big topic as well. And also, finally, it's disaster aid and crisis management. And I think, the biggest example is COVID recently. That's also an important thing of what we do. The RIVM can be a quite complex organization, especially for me. I started 3 months ago, so I'm still figuring out how everything works. But from a very high over perspective, it's divided in knowledge domains, and also there are executive domains, and there's some general departments. So first of all, we have 3 main knowledge domains. So these are domains in which the RIVM, they're experts and they should know the most about this. So first of all, this is infectious diseases. Secondly, it's the environment and safety. And third, it's the public health and services. So this is also something about lifestyle sharing. So for example, if there's a research about obesity, then this will be shared to the public, or you can read about it in the news. Then there's one executive domain, and this is all about prevention programs and public health upscaling. This was created, I think, after COVID to be better prepared for if something happens after COVID, that everything goes a bit smoother. And then finally there's some supporting departments which we are a part of. Specifically, we're part of the information services unit, which is basically everything that's related to IT is in that department. So that's also us. Another nice thing to share is that we're going to move to a new building. This is a very big topic inside the RIVM. I think it's like a weekly topic with colleagues. So we're going to move from Beeldhoven to the Science Park in Utrecht. And in general, it's better accessible by public transport, so people will take less time to travel. But also it's more modern, so some stuff is a bit outdated now, and we're also very excited to get some updated facilities. And I think that's the most important thing about the RIVM in a general sense, and then Alice will talk a bit more about Mendix.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. My name is Alice Jagersma. I started working with Mendix since up in 2019. And I'm working at the RIVM since February 2023 with Mendix. I'm going to tell something about how we make use of Mendix at RIVM. Our team is part of the Applications and Databases Staff Unit, also known as APD. Here you can see the structure. Our staff unit maintains generic applications like Teams, but we also build tailor-made applications. Mendix is not the only expertise that we have. We also have a .NET team, and we have people who are experienced in JavaScript and Java. Our clients are other departments within RIVM, and they have requests for tailor-made applications For example, we created an application for the Center for Infections and Diseases. Yeah, and because we're a small team, sometimes we need some help, and we're really glad that Sopra Steri provides us that when needed. Well, our apps, we started in 2019 with Mendix at RIVM, also with the help of Sopra Steria, formerly known as Ordina. The first app was created by Sopra Steria, and it was known as the Boeren en Buren app. In English, that translates as the Neighbors and Farmers app. It was a very interesting app. It was used in the south of the Netherlands, in Limburg. There are a lot of pig farmers there, and the people who live nearby experienced sometimes some bad smells. So they could notify the RIVM with this application when the smells were really bad. So the RIVM could do some research based on that. It was a hybrid app, and it's not in use anymore. But well, it was a very interesting project. Right now we have 9 applications, 7 in production, and 2 who are in development. And Wouter will tell something about one app later. Our uses vary, like 5 users for small apps and like 5,000 users for bigger applications. We have 3 native apps, and they're mainly used for gathering research-based data. On the, for me, left, for you, right, you can see a little example of that. This is an app to collect information about nitrogen, the amount of nitrogen in near beaches, in forests, and nature reservates. And those, the amount of nitrogen is measured in little tubes, as you can see over there. And those tubes need to be replaced every month. And we have an app who scans the tube, the code on it. So the person who changes the tube can take the old one and place the new one. And that helps with the registration. We have 6 apps, web apps, and they're mainly used for internal registrations. Like when you start working at the RIVM in a lab, you need some vaccinations, and we have an app who registrates that. We'll have also a bigger application that's publicly available. And when you're a nurse or a doctor or a researcher, you can sign up, and then you get information when there's an outbreak or a disease. And this application was also made with help of Sopra Steria. It's called signalen.rivm.nl. And it's our biggest app with 5,000 users. And well, I really like, for us, that's quite big. So, yeah. And I really like working with Mendix at RIVM because, well, the use cases are very, very diverse. And also the people are very nice. But we're a small team, and we also have our challenges. Well, we're having more apps, and that also means more operation work and more maintainability. And for us as developers, that's a bit of a problem because we like to develop, not only maintain. And we think it's going to help us to automate a bit more. We want to make use of Bitrise, but this also is a bit of a challenge to realize that. And we also have a challenge in accessibility. Not all our apps are that accessible yet, but we're working on it. And now I will give this thing to Wouter so he can tell some more about the project he's working on.
Okay. And let me stress, it's been really fun working with
the National Institute of Health. So let's have a look at the. Oh, maybe there are some questions for you guys. And I was wondering.
Yeah, it's working. Yeah, thanks for the inspiring story. I didn't knew that you were using that much of Mendix already, so that's very insightful. I was curious, did you start small? As you now have 9 applications, you have some with 5 users, some with 5,000.
Mhm.
Was the first app or the first 2, were they particularly small, as Mendix tends to position itself at newer customers, or was it like a big one first?
Well, it was a small one at first. As mentioned, the Boer en Buren app, Neighbors and Farmers app, it was quite small. It was used in a project, I think maybe 15, 20 people who used it. And yeah, so not that big. But I think in 2021, the biggest application was developed, the signalen.rvm.nl app. So
Okay.
yeah, it depends on the project and the.
And it's good to know that you're an example who started actually small.
Mhm.
Because I see most customers, they think, well, go big or go home. And then okay. But yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have a question as well. Are you? Do you have a portfolio of future apps which you're envisioning maybe for public health promotion?
Well, good question. Personally, no. But I don't know, maybe your manager is here, so maybe you can answer that question.
Yes.
Maybe a bit of a sneaky question, but
Maybe. This is the last time we work together. Well. Let's stand over here. My name is Steven, the manager of the Mendix team of the Department of Ontwikkelings or Development. One of our teams is the Mendix team with the .NET and Java, etc. So I think one of the main challenges is, well, it's also we have to do with all the political stuff. The new cabinet, government, yeah. New rules. Money is one of the issues that we are all driven by assignments we get from the ministry. When there are some questions about how the future will be. There's also the questions of our future. Will we get new assignments? Are there any developments? Because I think there's a lot of work. We have many Excel sheets, maybe familiar, and I think there's a lot of improvement. But it's also one question we have as well. As a department, and I think the whole RIVM and our organization in general.
and in a bigger sense than the government in its entirety, probably.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's have one more. Ooh.
I was wondering if you started 5 years ago, is Mendix respected in the IT department, and was there a turning point? I think when you start, you have to prove yourself, maybe, as a platform.
It is respected. Yes, and we're getting more known in the organization. But sometimes we also see that people start using power apps or outsource things and database. So sometimes it's a bit, I don't know how to say it well, but I think we maybe have to work a bit harder to.
I think it's also a
relevant
challenge.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it is.
It's like we have to do some promotion,
Mhm.
and we're not just developers in that sense. That we also have to do a bit of internal sales. It's basically how we do it. So that's also we have to figure out how and when we do it. So it's a learning process, I guess. And
hopefully we will manage that together.
Yeah, but we hear that people see the value of Mendix, and we often hear that we're fast on developing things. And well, product owners are really happy with that. So we're slowly making progress.
Keep up the good work.
I know that there are a few more questions, but could we maybe save them for later or maybe for the discussion afterwards with the drinks? So then we'll first finish the presentation, but we'll have loads more time. Okay, thanks. I'm Wouter. Most of you know me already. Mendix MVP for Sopra. Let's dive right in. So I think about a year ago, I was asked to consult on this project and to start thinking along with some of the potential requirements that would have to be filled out. I've sort of 4 parts to discuss. First, some background. Then I'll give you some domain tips that you'll be able to use. If you have your own dynamic forms app later, you'll be able to consult this, and then you will be able to forego the mistakes I made, hopefully. Some accessibility and a little demo. So first off, the requirements. So as Alice and Jasper already said, there are various clients within our RIVM, and one of these clients is the mill center, and this center is responsible for the environmental quality of air, of water, etc. And they run various programs, and one of these programs is called the National Monitoring Network for Effective Fertilizer Policy. Sorry, I had to look that up for a minute. But they also take a look at their groundwater quality. So they call these LMM, Landelijk Meetnet Mestbeleid, and LMG for groundwater. So basically what they do is they send out people to various farms all across the Netherlands, farms or companies or measuring points even, maybe somewhere along a highway or a nature reserve. And people will have to use a quad because they need to bring along a lot of gear in order to be able to do measurements on the quality. So as you can see, there's a quad here with a cooler, and this person is actually inserting a sort of pole in order to be able to get a water sample from a well, in this case. It could also be like this, where a person is actually drilling a hole in the ground in order to reach groundwater and then take a sample, and the sample is then stored. Or it could be a ditch from which a sample is taken. And in the end, several measurements are taken depending on what has to be measured. And here you can see actually how many devices have to be taken along. And as you can see, an app is used to record these measurements. And that is where Mendix comes in, because this app was up for replacement. And so that's where sort of my journey started a year ago when I was asked to consult on this project. So the requirements were basically to have a rebuild of the Angular app. It should be a native offline app in which a sampler can pick up some assignments for farms, etc. Maybe divide some work with somebody to help. Do all sorts of surveys depending on what type of samples are taken, what type of measurement or sampling method, etc. And in this case, these questionnaires, which are dynamic in nature and can change actually based upon what the measurer actually does in real life. So if it turns out that there's ice on a ditch, for instance, he might change the measuring method to something else. Take some grass actually and pull out the water that's in the soil. Something like that can actually be done, and so it means that there has to be an offline dynamicity in there. Questions come from a backend. In this case, Oracle with Oracle REST data services on top, which was interesting. And also lots of GPS locations would have to be stored, but also one of the requirements was for the measurers to be guided to the correct measuring points. Think about roughly 50 measuring points on a farm, and you would have to find all of these. alongside all of that would be a lot of company info, who's the main farmer in this case, telephone numbers, maps, anything. And then finally, if you take all of these measurements, that's nice, but you also need to take the samples and send them to the lab for confirmation later on. So water sample bottles had to be scanned. And then finally, the results would have to be able to be handed in. Again, there was an existing backend, and why offline? Well, in lots of places on fields, we do not have reception, so there's a there was an issue with that. That's why they chose a specific offline construction. We already had designs, so a designer had done intensive work to use the National Style Guide. And right here, you can see actually here an example of a number of measurements being taken. And everything had to be accessible. And roughly speaking, at some point in time, you have to go offline versus you have to go online. So this was the offline part. So the filling out of the surveys, locations, scanning bottles, etc. And then all the other bits were online. And that's handy to know because that's one of the tips for later on. So why these 10 tips, right? To learn how to think differently about dynamic forms, to make it secure, performant, maintainable, and just a lot easier to implement. Because I thought I knew it all, right? I've built native apps. I've built dynamic survey apps. I thought I could do this, right? Easy, let's just do it. Why is native a bit more difficult than the standard web apps? It's because of builds, data modeling restrictions, syncs, client logic, JSS styling versus CSS. And it can really break your app if you don't do it right. You miss a comma, then bam, offline. Different widgets, there's a page stack, etc. And during this talk, I'll focus on the data modeling restrictions because otherwise it would be too much. So imagine, this is actually a screenshot of a dynamic survey app I built five years ago. And you can see that there is this question at the top, right? And all of these specializations of question are shown at the bottom. So we have a text question, a text area one, we have a decimal, an integer, etc. And likewise, we can have a list of questions with all sorts of different flavors. Why do we use inheritance there? Basically, so we don't have to repeat ourselves, dry. So we can show all of these questions in one list. But then for native, there are some issues. We don't have inheritance. We can't use that on native pages. We'll get a compile time error. We can use one-on-one associations, but I have a ticket open with Mendix that failed retrieving all over the one-on-one for a year already. So it's problematic, trust me. And it's not really necessary. You can solve it with one-to-many. And not many-to-many. You'll get compile time errors there as well. So then we have an issue, right? So how about the select help to many? Not possible. How about the validation settings one? Not possible. So we needed something else. And in this case, we were also using a backend service, which was going to give us a basic JSON structure with questions. And here you see there's a question item, then a list, lijstwaarden object with a list of lijstwaarden. Same thing here, right? So these are what I call list objects. And they basically allow you to, to have one object managing your list, right? That's actually the first bit of advice. But you can turn these off quite easily. Usually we tick that button, right? Check all. But these specifically, if you turn them off, that'll help already. So that's the first bit of advice, not to use list objects. Okay, so then we have this question object. Entity, sorry. The second bit is we need a flat list of questions. So instead of using lots of specializations for one type of question for text, one type of question for integer, etc., we make it flat. And as you can see, there's a minimum and a maximum in there. So VMG min, VMG max, and there's something like a VMG type, which says what type of question it is actually. So basically, that's the second bit of advice, if I'm correct. Yeah, use the super question entity. All of the types you put into one object and use an enum with conditional visibility to show the proper snippets you want to show. So flat list of questions. And then storing the answers, that's also that was sort of a puzzle, I'll be honest, because I thought, right, I'll just be able to do it with relations, right? We'll have a separate question and separate answer and separate condition, and we'll model everything like a proper relational domain. But basically, it became overcomplicated. So we had to dial it down, really make it simple. So in this case, the advice is to create an answer question entity in which you copy the attributes of the question and allow the user to be able to answer in the same entity, right? So in this case, the answer question, we're calling it antwoord here. It can contain something like a number value or a time value or a text value, as you can see. So you duplicate the attributes from question, and likewise, you can keep everything simple and just present a simple flat list, right? And likewise, you also do not have to embed a data view within a data view within a data view within a data view. So you can forego a lot of nesting, which will cause rendering issues, may cause rendering issues in React Native. So here's the design, and basically what you can see here, at least the way I looked at it, it's a flat list of questions. The first question starts after train one per sale null at the top, and then ends after nay, right? And then we have the second one, third one, etc. And we can really have a flat list of question answers in this case. So they're all pre-prepared. The only thing I have to retrieve is the list of antwoord in this case. So here you can see the actual page, which has a couple of main objects, but then here is that list. It's a single list of answer with a whole of a lot of snippets with conditional visibility. But again, we're using a super entity for this. Everything that we need is in here. It'll work. It'll work beautifully, actually, because the conditional visibility is really powerful in Mendix Native. So use a super question answer entity. That's the third tip. By the way, so if you don't do that, you might run into these kinds of issues. You see what's happening here. An answer is entered, and then something else is done, and then everything re-renders because there's loading. It doesn't work. So my advice is really to keep it as simple as possible, a single flat list. Then security, an essential component here. It's defined. Yeah, sorry, question. We have no web client actually in which we can enter. So it's just native. Yeah. So talking about security, there are two parts. There's the read-write part and the create-delete part. Regarding read-write, there's a couple of things you can do. First off, separate the question and the answer, right? The question is read-only. You could just read that basically. And then for the answer, you can actually create it and edit it, etc. And then it will really be handy if you check the store owner checkbox, which you can see right there. And you will also add a Boolean is locked, which starts with false when it's created. And once you hand in the survey later on,
and then you log everything. You can still read it, but you can't edit it anymore. So that's the way to basically say, hey, there's a specific context in which we can allow edits of questions and prevent future edits of questions. So tip 4, read write, use owner plus not is logged. And you can see that right here. So this is the actual write, not is logged, and system owner is current user. So if I create a new question, this is what will apply. And then later on, after I handed it in, it will be logged, but I can still read it. And then there's actually more, but that goes beyond the scope right now. So then there is an issue because you can create objects within your client. So that basically also means that you can mess up your database and endlessly create answers, right? So how do you prevent that? That's this issue. That's the second bit on how to really properly manage the create part of objects. So to guarantee a validatable answer, I've sort of thought we need to check basically that this entity is embedded in our data structure. Because once it is, and we run that final hand-in validation, then we'll be able to say, hey, this answer it will be retrieved because it's got associations, right? So if I start all the way from the top of the assignment and I do all of the retrieves and all of the answer links are actually filled out, then that answer will be picked up by the validation, and we can actually do checks on the answer. Is there a number inside? Has the text been filled, right? So we can do checks on the server like we could do on the Mendix client. So that's the first bit. And then if filled, these validations will work on the server end. If not filled, we just won't store them on the server end. And we can do that by using a before commit event. So we can just check, have all necessary associations been filled? If so, fine, we'll save it for you because it will be picked up in a validation. And if not, we just won't store it. Likewise, you can prevent people from messing up the database. So that's number 5. Yeah.
Well, if you don't store it, it's lost or still on the client.
It's still on the client, so the client will be able to fill it out actually. And the question here is, to what degree can we trust these objects that have been created in the client, right? But I've always been taught, don't trust anything that comes from the client. You should always validate everything. And that's sort of an issue with native, where you need to give creation rights, and then people can do their work, and it could take a really long time for all of the data to be properly set. So this is a way to sort of say, okay, you can take all the time you need to fill out these objects that you've created, they're yours, but I won't take these into my database unless you properly set everything up, so that next time when you actually hand in the entire assignment, everything can be properly validated. This will really work well. I can show you an example later on if you'd like to see. Actually, here you see that example. So here we check, is the owner filled? Yes. If not, there's manipulation going on. So there's a bad actor there. Is the answer connected to some sort of context? In this case, the assignment itself. And is it connected to a question? So if these don't apply, then we add a log, because basically someone's been manipulating the client. A hacker has been working. Right? Okay.
This validation then returns a false, but I assume your before commit always return true.
No, in this case, we're returning a false, so the server will not store this answer until these relations have been set. Because only then can we do server-side validation on all of the data structure that we get and make sure that everything is properly filled out. I'll show you a bit more in a bit. There's a second example coming. I think you'll understand it then. So the second thing is that provisioning objects is something that you usually do before you start and you land on the page. So in web, you just put in a data view with a microflow, right? Create an object or a list even, doesn't really matter. You put it on the page and it works. That will not work on native. You will see the widgets, but the objects will not be visible because they haven't been prepared yet. So you will get an empty list. So usually provision your objects and then show the page. That works best. And then basically during that provisioning, you set all of those relations as well, right? So to already guarantee that the basic premise is there for a proper data structure. Hope this makes sense. Then imagine you have hundreds or even thousands of questions and you sync them all at once. It will take some time, right? Syncs of survey data should be synced from client to server in order. That was quite a puzzle because we had questions that were related to each other, that had links to each other. And then I knew that the association was filled. We did it before commit check. I did a retrieve of the related question and it was not there because it hadn't been synced yet, right? So you need to be aware of sync order in general, or maybe even do all of that stuff once you know that your entire domain is valid, right? So all of that linking between questions, if any applies, you can do it at that time. So syncing in order, especially when you have data in a hierarchy, starting with one to many, to many, to many, to many, etc. You can do that in a nanoflow from top to bottom. Especially when you use event microflows for reference data, as I just showed you with the before commit. So here's an after commit answer. And I'm doing all sorts of checks and doing retrieval. So retrieving a question and an assignment, that'll be okay. But it actually already starts here that the opdrachtwerkdag, which is a way of grouping certain answers, that may not be synced yet if I have my after commit running. So it could be that I'm going right here into this false flow where I'm saying, hey, there's a missing relation. Check it again later on, and we'll do some fixing later on, right before we send it back to the Oracle data service. And likewise, the related answer, it might not be there yet. It's exactly the case that I just gave. Just be aware of this. It's going to help. Otherwise, you'll think, hey, this one's filled. I can actually see that, but I'm not getting an object. And that's why we're doing ordered syncs. So use top-down ordered sync backs. Regarding that, you also need to really consider when the user goes off and online, because the whole syncing aspect, what data do you need to be able to work offline? When do you send it back? Can you send it back in between, for instance, of what will happen? Really carefully separate the questions for person A and person B. If they have access rights to the same objects and you have something like store the change date, you'll get issues as well. So really think carefully about when the user goes offline. I'd like to show you some actual context now, because we've seen the question and answer part, but not how it actually ties into the assignment itself. So let's see if we can show that. Yeah. Okay. So right here in the middle, you'll see the assignment, which is linked to a project. And then one of the first questionnaires that one of these measurers will fill out is the questions about the location. Is the farmer present? Have you discussed something with the farmer? Do you want to write down some notes, etc.? And this list of questions is the generic question list, which you see right here. So this is what is synced to the device. And then we have this list of IDs. And this is loosely coupled, so there's no association to question here, but what we basically do is, based upon this list, we create a number of question answers, right? We first retrieve the linking question using the ID, and then create a question answer and copy all the attributes. And then we can open the page. And we can do that at several places. So we actually do it in 3 places. So here you see that opdrachtwerkdag. you start your work, basically, you have some devices that you need to check in because measurements taken later on might be faulty. So we need to know exactly what devices were used to do certain measurements. Then we do basic measurements at the beginning of the day and basic measurements at the end of the day to guarantee that these devices are working. So as you'll see that there will be 2 control measurements with devices, and there'll be measurements right there, and these lead back to answers. So that's the second point of contact with answers. And then there's a third one. So if we go to the location, we can go to the company data, and then we'll get to a number of measuring points, which are belonging to a field, a certain place on the farm. And again, here we'll see that there is a sample which will have answers. So this goes really deep. So that's 3 points, 3 connecting points already. And that was one of the challenges to get everything to work in here. Any questions so far? All questions are basically, I'll show you that at the end. There are assignments that you can actually pull into your device. Then you will get everything that you need. You can select a person to work with, do a division of work, and then you go offline. So basically, the other person will get his own questions. You have your own questions, and that's it. That's done in the backend of the existing Oracle, I think Oracle Apex they're using. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there's a bit of advice here as well. And the advice is to enable loose coupling, like with the ID, the VMG ID I showed initially. So there were multiple places in which I had IDs, a list of IDs. The only thing I had to do was retrieve that question, duplicate it into an answer, and then we could start the page and set everything up. Finally, we used on-change validation. So that's a perfectly normal practice in essence for questionnaires. But when the user changes an answer, so depending on the question type, we do the right validation. So imagine we have this super answer entity, right? So all sorts of different conditions. We might do some calculations. And for conditional questions, we might have to evaluate certain conditions even, notwithstanding the type. So it could be a list item, like multiple choice, or text, or an integer, or a decimal, or a time, etc. So that all had to work with conditional questions. And there would have to be an optional commit. That's a very important one. I'd say it's one of the last bits I changed. Basically, you only want one place in which you have this monstrosity of a validation. That is why you use that on-change validation. You want to be able to reuse that when you validate your entire page. If you include a commit in a loop, it will be very slow. 45 answers, 20, 30 seconds easily. And if you omit the commit, you just pass on all of the questions to a commit list and save it once, it will be 300 milliseconds. That difference is something that we discovered later on. We thought we could get away with a loop commit, but we couldn't. So it was a very instructional one. Here you see the actual on-change commit. So we have an answer that comes in and we can decide to commit or not. We create a commit list. And then depending on the type, it being a number or a list item or text or etc., we do the actual validations. So in this case, for number, we're doing something with the date time that it was last changed. Then we validate the actual input. Then we have 2 types of validation. We have a warning and an actual red validation, so a yellow one and a red one. And we may do some calculations, and then at the end we decide to commit or not. This really works well, so use it as a blueprint by all means. So that's it. Use one dedicated on-change answer validate nanoflow with optional commit. So these are these suggestions. They'll save you a lot of time. And then finally, the accessibility part. So in what is accessibility, right, for people who might not be able to see, or it should be accessible to anyone. Right? For people with any disability, maybe there would be people who have issues with focusing, etc. It could be all sorts of things. Coming June, the EEA, European EAA, it should be, sorry, will come into effect. And that means that for any public app, we will have to enable full accessibility or else we'll be liable. And that's why actually for this project, accessibility was part of the definition of done. We started developing and then things got hard and we ended up with an accessibility semi-sprint. It took us 5 full days to fully refactor everything. So it was doable like that, but it's basically best to just develop it as you go. Question? Actually, both. Yeah. So.
But what kind of inspector is handicapped and takes samples with the help of this app?
That's a very good question. Yes. Accessibility in that sense is not just visual impairment. It could be lots of other things as well, right? And or maybe it could be that this person has -10, right? So it would just be difficult to see. It doesn't mean that this person cannot do this job. And the EAA is intended for these minority people to be able to do their works.
He had to drive a clock to get there. So if...
Yeah, yeah. Basically, trust me, this law is here to help these people so that they don't have to say, hey, I'm doing this job and now I can't do it. It's to protect them. Yeah. Be aware of it for any public app that you build. Yeah. And also for any commercial app that you build for customer, a customer-facing app, that will also apply. Yeah. So what we basically did is things like scalable SVG, and we took a lot. We did a lot of manual testing with VoiceOver, and I'll show that in a bit. And then as we went over all of the pages, we had to do a lot of fixing. It was actually complex. So it's a challenge, a really nice one. I really like doing this. And the web part we checked with AxDevTools, beautiful tool. That was actually the simple part. So it's the manual testing for native that was a bit more difficult. You'll have to get used to activating VoiceOver and have all of the gestures, etc. But it's really cool. Yeah. And in the end, by the way, we found out that we didn't have enough contrast. So our design was not proper. So we took a darker shade of blue. Yeah. We're not fully compliant yet. And part of that is due to, well, let's call it a difference of opinion on certain widgets in Mendix, which will be fixed actually. So Mendix is working really hard to get there by the deadline of June.
Yeah, that was actually my people's question. Mendix able to be fully compliant.
It's working really hard on it. It's taking my tickets very seriously. Yeah. So and in all, 90% of it is already accessible. It's small things like filters on data grid too. Yeah, and then you can even put in a value already, right? But it'll just be a lot of work. Where we can have like native. So here's the product manager for native, Jonathan. He set this out that if you don't fill anything out, you'll get the basic caption of any widget that'll be transferred into the accessibility field, which is genius. Yeah, it works really well. So obviously images need captions and we had some bits in web, for instance, where I had containers that you could click, and I changed that to buttons to make them accessible. So if you just use the semantic tools that you have in HTML, and you know that that a container is not intended maybe as a clickable thing, but a button is, then you will already get the semantics needed for accessibility. So it takes some thinking. Yeah, I have a demo, but we're running late. Shall we go to Jonathan first and then do the demo, or shall we do a very short demo? Demo? Okay, we'll run a bit late. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Mendix still running? Yes, it is. And it should be presenting. Are we getting something here? Let's see. Yeah, it's working. Okay, so I've already logged in. I'm using the Make It Native app because I don't have an iOS build. We're working on that. Jonathan will tell you a bit more about builds in a bit. We're looking at the actual app, it's loading. And the first thing I'll do is I'll start looking at what is available in planning so that I can choose an actual assignment. If Mendix is going to be helpful. Mm, 20 seconds. Should be okay. Yeah, there it is. So we'll go to planning. And here I can see the actual assignments that I can pick up, right? So if I pick up one of these assignments, I just select it. And obviously I'll have to be online and I can pick up this assignment. So right here, you see a couple of assignments I picked up. Let me show you voiceover. Hey Siri, doe voiceover aan. Hey Siri, doe voiceover aan. Okay. Okay, so anything that's selected will have to have a voiceover, and you can use swipe right to check if that's the case. Okay. Yeah, so now, for instance, here, for just the regular interface, you could just tap the entire box, and then you would go into the next page. But for accessibility's sake, you also have to be able to read all these parts. So the interface actually changes the UX part of this. We had to program it in such a way that you can tick the top part. And then you'll go into the actual assignment. I can also go back. And likewise. Okay. Do you believe me? I'll turn it off. Hey Siri, doe voiceover uit. Okay, it's really handy to learn all of these gestures and commands with the phone that you're using, and as soon as you get that in order, then it sort of becomes simple to test this. So as I said, you can work together, right? So I can select a person to work with us. Jasper, I'm going to select you. You've been selected to drill holes, and then now I can actually start the assignment. As soon as I start it, all of these choices that have been made become definitive. So we're going to go offline. So this is the key moment. And then we'll start with the first questionnaire, which is location question. So I can take a look at that. In this case, I have quite a few. Some of you might actually want to have a validation from the start, right? You can do that using the validation button. I'd actually like to show you this one very quickly, where we have conditional questions. So in this case, was maintenance necessary? Yes. And if it's necessary, you'll immediately see the conditional question that goes with it. If I turn it back to 0 to no, it will disappear again. And then using the validation, we'll also get a validation message here, right? So I can go to the next page, but I'll be reminded, hey, you're not done yet. So I can actually continue in this case. At some other places, we won't be able to continue. So that's basically what we did. We've got things like lists. as well. It's working really quickly and effectively and dynamically. So that was my talk on dynamic forms.
Thank you.
Maybe for brevity's sake, we move on to Jonathan. Doesn't mean that you can't ask questions later. If you'd like to use this.
Yeah.
Yeah, should be working.
Right. Cool. Thanks a lot. Quite excited to ask some questions myself. But I'll try to make this part a bit quicker so we can actually have some time for questions. But first of all, as a local resident, I have to clarify something. Not every part of Limburg smells like pig farms. All right. So moving on. I'm actually going to talk just actually very little about Bitrise. I'll talk mostly about how to kind of apply what we learned and enabled for Bitrise, which is one build pipeline that we currently also recommend as kind of your direct replacement for App Center. But I want to do a little bit more of a generic approach and explain to you what actually needs to happen to build a native mobile app with Mendix and how you can apply that to potentially any pipeline or any CI service out there and make that work with Mendix. And that's currently also what we're pursuing. We're trying to gather more information, add more documentation, and explain to our community how you can connect various services to Mendix and make them work so you can freely pick your favorite pipelines and hopefully automate and make your building much simpler. However, before I go in there, I have one important topic that I do want to address, which is our support for native mobile. And we just recently announced that we're going to change how native mobile apps are supported in Mendix. And the reason for this change is really that we observed in the past that the current promise of building an app with Mendix and then having that just run on one version for 4 years, for potentially 5 years, is just not realistic with native mobile. And the main reason for this is that the native mobile or the mobile ecosystems just fluctuate and they evolve way too quick. There's a new version every year of both Android and iOS, often coming with breaking changes. And if you want if you do not maintain your app to support these breaking changes, then the operating system vendors will kick you off their stores, and the app also won't work on the latest version on latest phones and so forth and so forth. And we tried really hard to make it work up to now with like Mendix 9 apps still work on most modern operating systems. We're currently still struggling with Android in the latest version, but it's kind of working. But again, it's so much difficulty and so much energy we have to put into this. And it's also, we feared the last year that we can support this, which is why we're motivated for this change. So in the future, and that's actually starting with this year, in general, every version of Mendix that is either MTS or LTS will be supported for 1 year. And that means we encourage yearly upgrade cycles for all apps containing a native mobile frontend. As an illustration, you can see here all the lines are basically half year, they're 6 months. And I've also added here the orange markers where you can see when a new operating system, mobile operating system, is typically released. It's about mid of the year. And what we announced will happen is in June when Mendix 11 is released, and that will be the point where we will switch this support policy. So that's when we will say these apps or all of the Mendix versions that are supported today will actually run auto support for native mobile, and you should then move to the next version to stay on a version that will work on all operating systems and will continue to work with mobile. With one exception, 10.18, that it was just released in December, that will stay a little bit longer supported. But again, it's always 1 year, so it's very predictable when something runs out of support. However, we do want to allow yearly support cycles, which is kind of difficult like this, because you would have like no time to upgrade. That's why we are adding a 3-month period at the end of each release, which is really intended for now the app is running out of support, or the version is running out of support. So now you have 3 months in which you can migrate it to the second next MTS or LTS version, and that without running or risking to run out of support. So yeah, that's what we're suggesting. And one of the things I can personally recommend is following this plan, which means you will go to the LTS version whenever it's available. And 1 year after that, again in June, you can then go to the .12 version. You can also do the inverse and go to .6 and .18, but typically this is the more normal or more common approach, and it's also from the timing, I think, a little better to do the upgrade sometime end of summer, typically better than around Christmas. All right. Right, switching gears, let's talk about mobile building. What does it actually mean to build a native mobile app? So for web apps, it's quite simple, or PWAs. You just deploy them with your application, and then they're on a web server somewhere on the internet. You point your web browser to them, voila, you have your client, you have everything working. You publish an update, you refresh your browser, it's automatically there. It's extremely convenient. That's also why we always recommend try to look at PWAs when you're doing mobile. They can do a lot, and we're continuing to invest more in it and make them more capable. But yeah, the prime reason for this is deployment distribution is so easy, updates are so easy. That's one key factor for PWAs and web-based apps. If instead you're going native mobile, it means you have to install the app on the device. You have to go, for example, to the App Store and then actively tap, yes, I want to download this app, and then it's installed on your phone, and then you can use it and keep using it. It also means when an update is released, that update is released to the store, not the phone yet. And the user actively has to upgrade that app on the phone. All of that takes time. Furthermore, this app needs to be built, needs to be compiled for the operating system, or for all operating systems that you want to run on. Well, a website is just HTML, and every browser is kind of similar and can render it. With native apps, you actually have to build it specific to the device or to the operating system you want to run on, typically Android and iOS. And these build files then also need to be uploaded to the stores, but the stores, or mobile operating system vendors, they've learned a lot about malicious software and other things happening in earlier computer systems. So they're very, very critical about what apps you can actually upload and access through their stores and install on their devices. Especially Apple is very careful here. And at a minimum, they always want to know who you are as a developer, and that needs to be signed into the application, so nobody else can actually manipulate that after you build it. But that process involves some pretty tricky security-related processes, which can also, again, if something is not set up correctly, that will result in errors, will break your builds, and will be difficult. Well, it's not difficult to fix, but it's kind of annoying because it's a slow process to fix this. So, yeah, and this whole process is called basically building or compiling to create the application artifact, which is typically just a file, and then signing, which is the process of making sure this is your app and nobody else can change it. So if you look at the typical build process, this is really what it looks like. Your application source code comes in, some magic happens, and a compiled application comes out. Let's look a little or a bit deeper into what this actually means for a cross-platform application, such as Mendix apps. So we're using React Native cross-platform toolcode. It means basically from one application source, we can have two different build processes targeting the different operating systems that get two different outputs. For iOS, we get the IPA. For Android, we get the APK. And those we can then use to install on the various devices. So since Mendix isn't just a React Native app, this is how it would be there. but it's even a little bit more complicated with Mendix. Because there's one additional step, which is to prepare the application. And what this means is your Mendix application project must be used to run some processes and pre-compile kind of the logic part of the application. Like everything you put in the number flows and pages, all of that needs to be translated into something that React Native then understands and then put into this template. And then once that is done, then the template can be compiled. And the native template, that is what Build Native App creates for you or downloads for you and then configures for you. That really is just a React Native project that we use and fill with various parts. And after that, the build process is actually very similar to just a regular React Native build process. Right. What does this prepare step do? There's a couple of things that happen here. The first step is, and these steps are all done by the Build Native App tool. So when you create a new Mendix project with the native mobile profile, then there's a new entry in the app menu, Build Native App, and that launches an external tool that is maintained by us as well, and that performs these steps. First step is it checks what Mendix version are you using, and then it goes onto GitHub, and there's a file in our native template project called Mendix version, and it looks up there which template version should I use for that Mendix version. And that's actually a handy file to sometimes look at because it lets you understand which major Mendix versions introduce bigger changes into the template because the template version was incremented, and that can help a little bit in understanding, like, or maybe also informing when and what version of Mendix you want to test and want to go to potentially. The second step that then happens is the appropriate template version is downloaded. It's just basically downloaded by downloading the release from GitHub. That's just a zip file that's then put somewhere on a temporary folder or on a folder that you select, extract it, and yeah, then we have your starting point for the template. Then the template's configuration is updated, and a bunch of settings are written into the template itself. Most of these settings come from this tool the Build Native App tool, where you fill in things like the application identifier, which permissions you need, and which other things you do. But the other thing that is actually also added here is custom dependencies. If you use a pluggable widget or a JavaScript action that uses a custom React Native module, such as we have a really good example for a JavaScript action that then loads the NFC module to interact with NFC tags. So these customizations are at this stage applied to the React Native project. So new or more libraries can get into your native part of the application as well. And finally, the application, what was called the application bundle in a React Native application is updated. What does that mean? That's also a step that takes by far the longest. That's where you put the spinner, and that can take tens of minutes typically. But this is also something we have actually quite little control over. So what happens here is Mendix will generate JavaScript resources from all of the pages and JavaScript actions and put them all into actually the deployment folder. You can actually look in there and take a look yourself. Quite interesting to see what gets generated. And once all of that is generated, then the tool from React Native, which is called Metro, is run to take all of those sources and combine them into one file. Alongside all of the dependencies and everything else that is needed. So it basically compiles all of the source code into a single JavaScript file. That is actually done twice, once for Android, once for iOS. There can be differences also on the client level of JavaScript projects. These files, once they're done, are actually placed into the native template. And you can find them. I've listed the paths here. So once you've created the template, you can go there, you can check and see if that file has been placed there. And you can even look at it and do things with it if you want. What's interesting here is though, this file is also if you have any changes in your Mendix application and you redeploy, but nothing else was changed. Like there's no new dependencies, there's no new settings or anything else. then the only thing that will change is actually this file. So then you only need to replace that basically in the template, recompile your application, and you're done. And if that is the case, that is also, by the way, when OTA updates will succeed, because this file can also be replaced by or over-the-air update mechanism. So this is also what we check when we declare if something is OTA ready or not. All right. So, oh yeah, one more thing to note here is the native template itself must also be stored because you're applying customizations to it. You have two options when you start with a build native app. You can select a folder to put it into, you should always select a folder to put it into now because we're not really talking about App Center much anymore. But you can also check GitHub. What that will do, it will automatically create a GitHub project for you and upload it there as well. I do recommend to use this option all the time for all of your projects because it's really handy to have the Git history of your template. It also lets you kind of inspect what has been happening, what's been done, which can be quite interesting. So something that's definitely recommended. If you don't want to have a GitHub token or you can't create it or you want to store it on some other Git resource, that's also fine. But you should then just do that manually. And ideally, if you do before you do any of the other steps. And essentially, if you want to connect a pipeline, that is actually critical to do in any case. So now for building, and that actually doesn't matter if you're building locally or if you're building in the cloud with the pipeline, there are some prerequisites, some things, tools that you need. You always need Git because we need to interact with, well, I guess if you never check it in, you don't need Git, but I want to list it here anyways. But you definitely need Node.js and NPM. And there's actually some restrictions to the version. We will clarify that in the documentation, especially for Mendix 9. You should use an older version of Node. But again, we will make sure to document it properly. For 10.18, it doesn't matter anymore. You can use the latest and it works. So then for iOS projects, if you're targeting iOS, you will have additional constraints. You will need a Mac hardware because you cannot build an iOS application on a Windows PC. It doesn't work. It's not possible. And even if you have a pipeline to do it, that pipeline must run on Mac hardware or it will fail, it will not work. And because to build iOS apps, you need Xcode. Xcode is the development environment from Apple. If you install it, you get a really nice IDE and everything around that, which I actually recommend for debugging purposes to also familiarize yourself with. But it also comes with a set of command line tools, which can achieve the same things. And we will use these in the build pipeline configuration. And the last part you need for iOS is one more package manager, which is called CocoaPods. That's basically what NPM is for the web world. CocoaPods is for the iOS world. So it lets you download various packages and use basically third-party libraries in your application. And this is used a lot by React Native. That's why you need that tool. Typically, it's fairly easy to install. And again, most pipelines know this and can make this already available. For Android, you just need the Android SDK. Typically, you install that if you do local builds by installing Android Studio. And here's my recommendation, use Android Studio Koala. We've had some issues with the latest version called Ladybug. So just use Koala to be safe. For now, we'll investigate. In the end, you only need the SDK though. The Android Studio is again just an IDE, a nice user interface, also really good for debugging and understanding problems. Also comes with a really nice emulator, so you don't even need a device for some testing. It's quite nice to familiarize yourself with if you want to do some local builds. But again, for the build itself, you just need the Android SDK. And the main tool there is called Gradle. And Gradle will basically take care of installing all of the dependencies needed for Android. So it's a replacement also for the CocoaPods, what CocoaPods is on iOS. And it will also initiate the compilation and everything else and create the APK file for you. Right, so building locally or in the cloud, what does it actually mean and what are the differences and maybe pros and cons around them? So if you do local building, one of the big pros is you can use all of the graphical user interface. You can use Xcode, you can use Android Studio, and there's a lot of convenience features built in. So it makes it actually quite a bit easier to set up and test things. And another thing that's really great is there's a lot of debugging capabilities. You get the console with the errors when it's running, which can give you a lot of insights. Well, if something is failing, that can really, really help. And so if you have any trouble with your builds, it's a really good kind of backup system to have in place to be able to quickly investigate things. And another thing that really, really helps here, especially if you're setting this up the first time, is you can do incremental builds. That means a common thing that happens is you build your app, you install all the dependencies, then you build it in I don't know, Android Studio, and at the end of that 5-minute process, there's some random error message telling you forgot this permission. So then you fix that, and if you kind of do it in a pipeline or with App Center, you fix it, you hit run again, and again you have to wait 20 minutes for the result if it actually worked or not. If you have this locally, Android Studio caches all that. So you just fix it, you hit run again, takes maybe a minute, and you see, oh yeah, it's not working, which saves a ton of time. And again, this is great for the first time trying to get it to work, because you can test all of these settings and everything you set up, and then know, okay, this is working, I got a local build working, I can now figure out how to get it to the cloud and automate it. Downside is, yes, you need a Mac if you want to do iOS, and you need one locally. So that's something that might not be even feasible for some of you. And if you just rely on local building entirely for everything, it is something that is very, very difficult, if not even impossible, to automate. So if you never think about pipelines, you might end up in a situation where you or one of your team becomes kind of the build bottleneck, because they're doing all the builds for everyone else. Not a good situation to be in for them or anyone else, really. That's where cloud building is really interesting. Challenge here is, the main challenge is it must use only the command line. So everything you do in a nice abstracted way in Xcode or Android Studio, you need to figure out what are the commands actually underneath the hood that are run to make the same effect happen. And that can be a bit challenging and intimidating. But that's also where we are very dedicated to help you and come up and with documentation and lists of what commands should be run. And it's also something where pipeline providers and continuous integration platforms can shine, because they can give you other abstractions that you can use. And the Bitrise is a really good example for a pipeline that does this really well, because it is, it understands React Native applications really well. It will detect, hey, your project looks like a React Native project. Should I set it up for you? And it will then try to automate a lot of the complexity away from you, which is quite nice. Second thing is, you don't really have any debugging capabilities. Instead, you only have logs. So that's typically what you have to then go through in the end to find out if something went wrong. And these logs are very, very long. So can be annoying to look at and parse. But again, the logs are tremendously useful, especially if things break. And then it's typically what I would do is always a mix of trying it again, maybe locally, seeing if I can replicate it, and then trying to find out what the issue is. We already talked about the failures. Benefits are most of the CI providers provide Mac hardware in some level. It's typically more expensive than Windows machines, but it's typically available. So you don't have to worry about getting your own Mac or asking your IT department to whitelist a Mac for you or something, which can be challenging. And again, it is really built for automation. So what needs to happen in abstract terms in a native build in the cloud? These are the most generic things that need to happen. So first, the template needs to be checked out. For this to work, you really need to have it in Git somewhere. It doesn't have to be GitHub, but it needs to be in a repo that is accessible by the cloud pipeline or the CI provider. And it needs to check out the template. The second thing it needs to run is npm install. This is also the first step explained in our local build documentation, and that also needs to happen in the cloud, obviously. For that step to work, you obviously need Node and NPM. So that's the first thing that sometimes you might run into, that the pipeline complains, I don't know what NPM is. That means you need to somehow tell it beforehand to install or have NPM ready. Most pipelines have some kind of setting that let you say which environment you want, and then you need to find one that has this already provided. Or you might need to add additional steps in front of this to make sure that all the prerequisites are met, that NPM is installed, that CocoaPods is installed, and other things that you may need. Then the third step is that's unique to Mendix. You need to run another npm command called npm run configure. What that does, it looks at the config.json file, which is also part of your native template, where Build Native App puts most of its settings, and it just makes sure then that these settings are correctly applied to everywhere where they need to be applied in the template. So something that you shouldn't forget. And these steps you should also always run every time after every build. Whenever you change something, you might not need to run them, especially if you don't change any settings in the Build Native App tool. But it's just the best practice to run them always. Just npm install, npm run configure. Just do it. All right, then you get to decide if you want to do iOS or Android builds, both. For iOS, you would then update or install the CocoaPod dependencies. That is done with the command pod install. And we do recommend a repo update here. It's probably not necessarily on CIs most of the times, but it doesn't hurt to update anyways. This just makes sure that there's nothing cached that's out of date that we're installing. And then the next step is to create the signed build with Xcode. That's actually one command, but it's a long one. It's Xcode. There's a build command in Xcode, and it lets you archive. Archive in Xcode terms means create a release build and export that into an IPA file. And it also needs a bunch of other configurations, like which target to use and which other configurations to apply. So that does a little bit more, needs a little bit more things. And that's also something where we're currently working on figuring out what exactly the concept is. For this to work, we actually need to instrument a little bit the project beforehand. That's quite challenging right now still, but something we're also looking into because you need to set the signing configuration correctly in the Xcode project. Something that's really easy in Xcode itself, but a little bit more difficult from the command line. Then, and that's already it. So that's actually quite nice about Xcode. It's just one command. It takes a very long time to run, but in the end, it will just say, I created this IPA for you. It's then in a known location, and that will then be the result of your pipeline. So for Android, it's a bit, it's actually a two-steps process, because the first step is to build the application with Gradle. The command here is much easier because it's really just Gradle W. That's a wrapper script that's added to the project, which takes care of some of the pre-configuration of Gradle, and then just tell it to assemble App Store release. That basically tells it assemble means create a release build and put that into an APK, and App Store release is the target, which is by default. That's how you call it. And that will already create an APK file, but it's not signed yet. So you need a second command where you use the APK signer, which is also part of the Android SDK, to then sign the APK and write that signature back into the APK file. And after you've done that, you can then export it and upload it. And just to give you a little bit of an insight into Bitrise, that's what that in the end looks like there. So in Bitrise, you define a workflow that basically follows all of these steps. And as you can see, we have the npm command. The first one is just npm install. The second one is npm run configure. We then have an extra step that's specific to Bitrise, which makes sure that I have the right Android SDK installed. Then Android build is exactly that. It uses Gradle W, assemble, blah, 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 to create the APK. And then we have the sign step, which again uses the APK signer to sign that. A nice thing about Bitrise, you can actually upload the key store to Bitrise, and it will then use that in the signing process. So you can also use it to host it in a secure way. You don't need to check it into your Git, which is preferred. So then we're switching to iOS. Next step is to run the pod install, which Bitrise gladly already understands and knows what that is. And then where this manage iOS code signing does a bit of magic by manipulating the Xcode project and adjusting the signing for you, which is quite nice. And we still need to do a little bit of reverse engineering what they're doing there, but it works really well. So this does magic with your project and make sure it's the signing is set up properly. And then this final one is the archive step that will create the IPA. And because the signing was configured before, this will then also use your proper signature and certificate to create a signed IPA. And then finally, another nice thing about Bitrise, it can then collect these artifacts that created, the APK, the IPA, and put it into its own ecosystem, which you can already use for some form of ad hoc provisioning. If you don't need your app in the store, you can actually host it here and then point your devices to this website and download the app directly from it. Note for APKs that works fine. For Apple, for iPhones, you need to pre-register the iPhone in your developer portal for this to work, and it's limited to, I think, 100 devices. So that's not an appropriate way for everyone, but it might be something useful for smaller apps and smaller studies. Cool. And yeah, the biggest thing I can say about Bitrise is we've had a few customers now play around with it, and I actually just heard yesterday from one. They were extremely happy with it. They just set it up in 2 hours and got it to work. And another customer from us actually praised especially that it's really fast. And you can make it even faster and even cheaper if you split out the Android and iOS builds, something we're not recommending ourselves, but another MVP, Marcel Holleweg, has posted a really nice blog post, which you can also find in our documentation, because it is a good recommendation if you, and in general also applies to other pipelines. If you can do that, that makes sense. Again, for the simple reason, for Android, you don't really need Mac hardware, and Mac hardware typically is a lot more expensive than non-Mac hardware. So it makes sense to split it into 2 processes that kind of run separate and build these apps separately. All right, that brings me to the end. So do we have time for questions?
We're running late, but let's have some, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Question about building.
Do we want to use the microphone?
Yeah.
So my question is about building an Android app. The steps you've showed us for building an APK, but the Google Play Store accepts attendees. So are the steps different?
No, it's the same step. You need to tell the Gradle to use a different target, not an APK, but an AAV. The reason I'm still stating, or most people still use APKs, is it's the only format you can install directly on devices. So if you're just going to build something and install it on your phone directly, that's still APK for you. And I believe like MDMs are also typically more happy with APK. AAV is really very Play Store-like thing. But again, if that's what you want to target, I believe it's just a different set in the build settings, and then you should get that. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually have a question for both Wouter and Jonathan. We saw the domain model of the generic question and answer module made earlier. Actually, I did similar attempts. Currently, I'm also involved in a project where we basically said, well, let's get rid of most of the specialization and let everything back into that one entity. So now, basically, my question is, should we forget everything we learned on data normalization and inheritance and just put everything into one big entity? Or should native capabilities be evolved so that it supports inheritance, etc.? Curious on both your opinions.
Do you want to start?
We've been having this discussion, I think, for years already, where we're saying basically, hey, why do I need to learn extra stuff when I'm doing native? Why do we need to change my approach? So I, for instance, suggested things like entity validations, regardless of client or server, or and I know that there's perhaps some good news. I'm not sure. I'll leave it to you.
Not about entity validation. I still like your. I remember an earlier demo that you showed where you replicated basically the validation.
That's what we did here as well. Yeah.
And so you can run them on client. And I still believe it would be a great benefit if we could have something like a flow that can run both on client and server. It's limited to what it can do, but it's good enough to support validations. I really love that idea, but it's difficult to convince our developers that that's also feasible to build. So I'll keep trying that.
Who would like to have those?
That's actually really show of hands. Who would be helped with that?
Yeah.
All right. That's about half, I would say.
But I think this question is also, I know that you're sort of considering expanding inheritance into native as well, right?
So there's many aspects to it. First of all, I can definitely confirm we are working on expanding modeling capabilities for native mobile. Or not, that actually doesn't have anything to do with native, it's all offline, because the same restrictions apply to PWAs. What we're currently working on is more association types. So we're looking at multi to multi, and if and how we can implement them also in offline. And it's looking good. I don't know yet when it will be available, but that's basically our next bigger thing that we're trying to tackle. And then I think one-to-one is already supported. We'll make sure to look at that ticket, and we can get that. Well, if it's supported and not throwing an error but not working, then we need to fix that. So we should really look at that ticket.
Okay.
About inheritance. So that inheritance is semi-supported already. You just need to make sure to never use multiple levels at the same time. But what you actually build, I think, would have been possible to actually make use of, because if you have your answer objects or your question objects, and we have one inheritance, one specialization for each, you will never use the question object. You will only use the specializations, and that is actually supported and works. However, if you start mixing, that is.
React Native, you're saying, right? So
in offline.
Already in Mendix.
Yes, you can use inheritance also with offline, but you can only ever use one level. So you can't really use inheritance because you cannot go up and down in your inheritance chain, but you can still use the same objects also in your offline first step.
So no casting from question.
Yeah, casting doesn't work. Type checking also doesn't work because again, you can only use one level.
Yeah.
So you lose a lot of the benefits of using, I'd say, inheritance.
And then on-change validations like I built won't be possible.
Let's stay with modeling first. The reason for this is actually that we actually have a challenge with IDs. The offline was kind of built under the assumption that every object has unique IDs, and that goes away when some share an ID to identify, hey, I'm actually belong to that other thing. And that is exactly what's breaking us of supporting this. This isn't unsolvable, but it goes quite deep in our architecture of offline and requires quite invasive changes. So we're a bit reluctant to rush that and make that the first thing to address. But again, it is also on our wish list to improve and allow inheritance also in offline. At the same time, what the reasons Wouter put this all in a flat list is, I think, still a valid reason to do so, because having the data spread across many different entities and interconnected like you would do on the web is always going to be challenging if you use synchronization to then get back and forth the data, because there's so many tables that need to be synced, that need to be aligned in content, and a lot more data needing to be transferred, which will just slow down things. So that's where we believe actually native mobile apps should get a bit of a different or not even native mobile offline apps, need a bit of a different architecture to work than web apps. And for web apps, this kind of works because you just query, or it's not even web. Again, it's offline versus online. This can also work in native if you just create an online native hub. And the same thing just works. You can just query many different data sources in a page and just use them because you're not caching all of that with the synchronization. That's where it gets really, really tricky and challenging. So that will not go away, even if we supported more of these interactions. And that's where we're a bit reluctant. What we are looking at is giving you tools to make it very explicit whether something is offline or online. So you can model it appropriately and do something like what Walter has done, but explicitly say, well, I have my online data store that's nicely organized, spread out across multiple tables and everything. And then you have a different section of your data of your domain model that's for offline, that is somewhat redundant of the online stuff, but optimized for display and rendering in your app. But again, it's very explicit, so you can tell why you actually did this, and you can still connect it to online bits. So you can you can make sure, so when you're syncing back and forth, that when the data is there and something changed, you can actually put it into your real structure and make it work there. So that's what we believe is a really promising improvement in the future, and something we're currently working on figuring out how to make that work. All right.
Hey, shall we go for drinks?
Last question.
One more? Yeah.
I actually spent some time messing around with the device today, and we got it working for Mendix 9 pretty easily. But for Mendix 9, we ran into some issues because, as you mentioned, you need to use an earlier node version, which is 16, right?
Yeah, I think I heard it also works with 20 or 18, but I think 16 is recommended.
Okay, yeah.
That's what we tested everything.
Yeah.
I should have found a fix for this today as well.
Okay, well, maybe we should have a chat later. Yeah.
Yeah. And also let us know so we can update the documentation and make sure to tell everyone. We've heard this from a couple sources. So yeah, we're working on it. Let's share how we get it to work.
Yeah.
And make sure everybody can.
Yeah, my question was related to Node 16 not being installed on most of the.
Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah, but there is also so there's a tool called RIVM, Node Version Manager, which is quite often pre-installed, and then you can actually use that to select whatever node version you want to. And I know for a fact that Bitwise supports it. So there's another action, RIVM, and with that you can just select a different node version, and then everything.
18 with that step.
Yeah.
Yeah.
18. We recommend 16, but if 18 works, go for it.
The error step I have it for.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I mean, if it works, it works. And again, we're quite happy with 10.18. We support latest node. So long term or even midterm, given the new support policies, shouldn't matter anymore.
Okay.
Cool.
Cool. Any questions you have still, obviously answer them. There are drinks right outside. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, RIVM, for joining us in this meetup. Thank you very much. It's been great having you. Enjoy the drinks and see you soon.